A small voice changed everything. The ballroom smelled of citrus and roses, the glow of chandeliers falling in warm sheets across tuxedos and silk. Conversation moved in polite eddies. Laughter was measured. Cameras quieted into flashes, like distant lightning. Ifeoma stood near the edge of the room, arms folded around a clutch, as though holding something fragile, the quiet kind of composure that had kept her moving through airports, interviews, and the slow compression of living abroad. She had not expected anyone to notice her. She told herself that often, as if it were armor. A little hand found the hem of her sleeve. "Can you carry me, ma'am?" the voice asked. It was small, bright, without calculation, 5 years old and absolute in its entitlement to attention. Ifeoma looked down and saw a girl in a pale dress dotted with tiny cranes, hair tied into 2 neat pigtails. Her cheeks were flushed from running. Her eyes were large and unafraid. When the child lifted herself up to reach Ifeoma's hands, the room seemed to be suspended between beats. No one spoke for a moment. The hush was audible. She could have said no. She could have turned the child toward a nanny or a table of adults who stampeded a path with gossip. Instead, something lightened in Ifeoma's chest. She bent, offering the lift, and the child came into her arms as if she had always belonged there. The contact was ordinary and seismic. The child tucked her legs around Ifeoma's waist, one small palm splayed against the back of her neck. The smell of soap and cake, familiar and immediate. A string of laughter rose somewhere nearby, the sound of guests, relieved by a moment of pure, uncomplicated human connection. Someone took a photograph. Ifeoma almost didn't notice the camera flash at first. She was looking at the child's face, a smudge of ink on the child's thumb, a gap-toothed grenade. The world narrowed to those details. Then a crop of phones turned toward them. Lenses found the tableau. A dark-skinned woman, in a simple dress, holding the chairman's daughter. A powerful man standing not far away with his hand tucked into his pocket, appearing stunned. By the time Ifeoma stepped back toward the buffet, a dozen devices had clicked their approval into the cloud. Hiroshi Hayashi watched from the perimeter of the ballroom. At first he attributed the tug he felt to something practical, protectiveness. His daughter had wandered off near the bandstand. His assistant had been preoccupied with guests and seating arrangements. He had looked routine, habitual, and then froze at the sight of Sora climbing into the arms of a woman he did not recognize. There was no scandal in the action. There was, rather, a soft permission in the way the child trusted someone outside their orbit. Sora's small body fit easily against the woman's shoulder. The woman's expression was tentative but warm, and when Sora laughed, an unadorned sound that had always been reserved for the rare few she allowed in, Hiroshi felt a sting he could not name. It was as if realizing, in an instant, that he had been keeping his daughter and himself at a distance from the world, as if that were a remedy. By the time the band changed the tempo and conversation resumed, a photograph of Ifeoma and Sora had already begun its path across the room and then the city. Someone's social account posted a grainy image with a caption about kindness from strangers. Within the hour, the scene migrated into the larger currents of the networked day threads of praise. Curious emojis, muted astonishment. It was small and shapeless at first. Then, as stories do, it found a shape in headlines. CEO's daughter finds sweet moment with new hire. The colors shifted subtly as the image traveled. Admiration became speculation, and then, in places, opportunism. Ifeoma felt the ripples later in the week as an undertow inside the office. At her desk, she kept a binder of local phone numbers, a list of remittance transfer codes, a photograph of her mother printed from a file she carried in her wallet. She checked the balance of the account that kept 3 younger siblings in a steady enough routine in Lagos, and she read recruitment emails with the economy of someone who had learned the arithmetic of risk and reward. Her colleagues began to glance at her with a new attention, some gentle and some sharp. Messages pinged with neutral pleasantries that hid a radius of gaze. "Nice to see you at the gala," one read from someone in investor relations. Another had a careful, corporate warmth. "Congratulations on your visibility." The ones that made her stomach tighten were the ones that didn't use her name, but used the idea of her, the concept. A moment that could be leveraged. Reiko Tanaka kept her hands folded on her desk, just as she always did, fingertips touching like a kind of social restraint. Her office was the kind of place where the temperature was always neutral, and the furniture was designed to match the company logo. She was charming in a way that had staked out more space than might be expected for someone who still checked the minutes on meetings. She had the talent for turning events into policy and charm into a professional instrument. "You caught that photograph?" Reiko asked later, voice casual, as a meeting starter. They were alone in the conference room, a sheet of glass making the rest of the floor feel distant. Ifeoma had already intuitively stiffened at the way Rako had said, caught, as if the situation were a netted item to be evaluated. "Yes," Ifeoma said. She kept her words small and measured. It had been her practice to keep nothing that could be parsed as vulnerability in long sentences. "I wasn't paying attention to—" "You weren't paying attention to the PR board's schedule?" Reiko smiled. "I understand. New hires remember the world as a breath, not a ledger." It was not a question. Reiko's gentleness carried a sharpness. It softened the edges of the suggestion. She sat back, letting her polished shoes find the exact notch in the office carpet. "This can be useful," Reiko said. "Visibility as a narrative. The chairman is humanized when his private life appears accessible. Investors like to feel the human side." Her tone turned insinuating. "Silk over steel. If managed well, this could be a net positive for you too. Increased recognition, an easier path to sponsorship." Recognition and sponsorship words that, layered with her people's industry phrases, sounded like ladders. Ifeoma heard the possible bargains. A seat more visible, a mentor aligned, perhaps, and asked to be put in touch with someone who could tilt her visa situation into something more secure. She had come to Tokyo with a suitcase of credentials and a remit that replaced the warmth of a steady paycheck back home. Every offer shimmered with a currency she knew how to count. There was, she understood, a darker ledger not said out loud. Reiko's smile hinted, like a shadow. "Of course there are perceptions to manage," Reiko added, specifying the cost without naming it. "The board watches closely." "The press loves a picture!" She tapped a finger lightly against the table in a metronome of caution. "Sometimes, if you are agreeable to the right kind of social arrangements, the company aligns to protect you. Other times, it does not." She let the implication hang. A thread of consequences. Ifeoma remembered her mother's voice speaking through a choked line when the rent had been late. "You are in other people's hands. Keep your hands clean." She had heard that admonition not as religion but as a map. There were strategies: work hard, be indispensable, refuse invitations that smelled of favors. Yet she also knew the work of networks. Sometimes they opened doors, sometimes they slammed shut without explanation. She did what she had always done. Make the list. The list had a column for family money to send, deadlines to meet, another column listed intangible cost, reputation, in an office that might call her brave or naive or both. A third column, the one she did not like to tally, was for the quiet parts of stealthy evenings she missed her mother's laugh, the birthdays she could not afford to fly home for. Those added up in small, devastating arithmetic. Ifeoma had been hired into international strategy because of her acuity, her fluency in markets many of her peers found obscure, and because she had a way of speaking not to impress but to align. Reiko's suggestion landed as a vector. Accept the invitation to be visible and see what the company would do. Yet the invitation came wrapped in an implicit question: whose terms would she accept and how would her acceptance be read? The HR email was politely phrased and cold in its efficiency. "We would like to remind all staff of our public conduct guidelines." It read, no reprimand, no overt accusation, but an invisible instruction to be careful. Ifeoma read it at her desk, with the glow of the monitor painting her skin in soft blue. Her phone buzzed with supportive messages from a friend in marketing and a terse emoji from her manager, whose involvement was exactly as far as it needed to be. At lunchtime, she sat with the sandwich she had bought from the stall around the corner and watched people move through their own orbit of obligations. In the days after the gala, the photograph multiplied. There were articles that admired the innocence of the child and the stranger. There were columns that used the photograph as evidence of a CEO's softness. a literary device to demonstrate a human face beneath a corporate emblem. There was the slower, harder undercurrent in the office, raised eyebrows, the amused hum of speculation, the polite curiosity of investors, and the professional attention that sometimes coalesced into opportunities like little storms that might flood or might nourish. For Ifeoma, the public attention was an exposure she had not requested. It turned work into a theater where private choices were visible to a public that enjoyed making moral calculations about strangers. In the quiet of her apartment that evening she sat on the windowsill, the city opening below like a map of routes she had yet to take. She turned her phone over and over in her hands, the cool plastic rubbing a comforting groove. Her mother called twice that week. The second call was truncated. "Send whatever you can," her mother had said in the clipped way that masked gratitude and worry at once. It was a mantra she sent, like a talisman. Ifeoma obliged. Money moved, a small safety net reconfigured across continents. She had been living in Tokyo for less than a year. Each remittance was a stitch to keep things whole back home. She tried, when alone, to name what the photograph had stirred in her. It was not vanity. It was a lightness she had not felt in months, the sensation that someone had placed a small, uncalculated kindness in her palm, and it fit. But the brightness carried weight. In the eyes of some, that kindness could be She had already been told, in corporate smooth tones, that the event might be an opportunity. The fact that the child had chosen her, simply and immediately, made the moment impossible to objectively categorize. Hiroshi kept his distance in the days that followed. He had his routines, meetings, files, a staccato of visits with the board. But the memory of the child in another woman's arms lingered like an echo in the hallways of his home. His colleagues noticed a slight slackening around his eyes during the early morning strategy briefings. He had always been a man who knew how to disguise feeling polished speech, implacable schedules, but there are places a man cannot guard without becoming small. His house, a compact rectangle on a quiet street, had become a repository for a loneliness he had previously treated as a private ache. The first time he heard his daughter humming in the morning, he stopped. He could pinpoint the melody. It was an old lullaby that his late wife had sung when Sora was smaller, the syllables attenda, repeating tied. Hearing it now, he allowed himself to notice the sound small, Janice, the way Sora made it her own, skipping a note here and adding a laugh there. He felt gratitude that curdled into something like fear. How to keep another person from the particular kind of solitude that had become his default. How to teach the child that the world was not only safety, but wild edges, too. A week after the gala, an envelope arrived at Ifeoma's desk. It had his seal, but it came through official channels in an unassuming way. Not a summons, not an order, but the kind of communication that said, quietly and formally, "We would like to speak." The assistant delivered it with a precision that made Ifeoma acutely aware of how much choreography existed in the world of power. She unfolded the stationery, and a plain, carefully typed note slid into view. Would she come to the chairman's office to speak? The message was curt, not an invitation, but a gesture of interest. Her first impulse was refusal. There were people at the office who would read the visit as acquiescence. There were HR memos that lectured about boundaries. Yet another part of her was careful, quickened by memory of the way the child had held her. In the summons, a request, not for surrender, but for explanation. She imagined the chairman's office, glassed around with its view of the city, carefully curated photographs of family and achievements on the shelves behind his chair. Each object in that room had a statement. Entering it would be stepping into a constellation of meaning she rarely inhabited. She agreed. The elevator ride-up felt like traveling through a wide, cylindrical shell. The doors opened to a quiet world where nothing blurted its presence. Everything was articulated by restraint. In the reception area, she was offered tea green, no sugar, by a young assistant whose hands held the cup like an offering. Ifeoma accepted and let the warmth pull the chill from her palms. Hiroshi's office surprised her by its lack of grandiosity. It was clean-lined and private without being ostentatious. There were shelves of books in English and Japanese, a few small objects that hinted at a life beyond the ledger, a chipped cup that might have belonged to his wife. the occasional pressed leaf in a frame. He stood when she entered. Despite his public reputation, his movement was not performative. He gave her the kind of greeting that belonged more to a man who had grown used to efficient social exchange than to one who hoped for intimacy. "Thank you for coming," he said in English, his cadence controlled, his voice the kind that revealed little but gave space for the truth. His Japanese was reserved. In English he seemed more willing to be plain. There was a small friction in the way he spoke her name, the way a man says the name of someone who has entered a new and fragile category in his life. They spoke at first about nothing of consequence, weather, protocol, how the gala had proceeded. Then he laid down the paper with Sora's drawing. It was simple. A house with a sun, 3 squiggled people, and a crooked heart in the center. Sora had apparently made it during a nosy afternoon and slipped it to her father, who had preserved it. Hiroshi tapped the page as if the gesture could explain the smallness of the thing. When he looked at her, his eyes soft. "She drew this for me," he said. She said, "Papa, the lady who picked me up, she kept me safe." His laugh was brief, incredulous. "She calls me Papa the way it is. Easier to say, but she calls strangers by their color if she doesn't know them. Yesterday she said the lady, and then, when I asked, the lady laughed. It surprised me." He talked then, haltingly, about loneliness. He framed it in the categories he understood: schedules, custody arrangements, public scrutiny. He spoke of being careful, of wanting his daughter to have a life not subsumed by his title. For all his reticence, there was a tenderness that entered the room like fresh air. "I am not here to make an offer you cannot refuse," he said at last. "I do not wish to complicate your position." He folded his hands as if making a promise. "But Sora was very comfortable with you. She asked for you. I would like, if you will accept, to invite you to dinner at my house with Sora. No obligations beyond that. Just dinner. I thought perhaps you could tell her a story from your home, if you would." "She was very taken with the height of your hair," she said. "I thought perhaps she might like to hear something new." Ifeoma felt all the practical alarms ring at once, and then, beneath them, a simpler chord strike. The offer was small, humane, and fraught. Dinner with the chairman could be read 1,000 ways. It could be an opportunity. It could be a risk. It was also the kind of invitation that would force her to choose. He watched her for a long moment, as if seeking permission to make some kind of unpacked. "I cannot promise anything regarding the opinions of others," he said with a sudden, merciful clarity. "But I will protect Sora in my home. If you come, you will be welcome for that evening, without rumor. I will also speak to Reiko. She will be told to leave this matter alone." "That I can do." The chair god in his voice was not an offer of currency, but a promise of boundaries. And it carried with it an implied humility so rare in men at his level that it made Ifeoma's throat tighten. "Why would you protect me?" she asked. The question surprised her. It was blunt, closer to a child's directness than to the cautious language usually used in boardrooms. His answer was not polished. "Because the sight of Sora with you made me aware that she needs someone to make things easy for her," he said. "Because she seemed happy, and for that I am grateful. Because there are things one cannot reframe. A child choosing to be small in someone else's arms is one of them." He paused, letting his words settle. "Also, because I am tired of being alone with my gratitude." Ifeoma could feel the minute arrangements of this conversation, how it would be rewritten in the office, how it would be stitched into the social fabric of the company. A protective promise was not a guarantee against gossip. It was, however, an unusual parody in a company that usually measured loyalty by outputs rather than small human acts. She did not say yes immediately. She had learned a particular discipline in saying nothing until the space required a response. She remembered the faces of her siblings when she had called them the week before with a voice that tried not to betray the way loneliness felt like a physical weight that did not loosen easily with relocation. She thought of the remittance that did not stretch as far as she wanted, and the careful accounting she did of favors and favors returned. Hiroshi saw the calculus in her eyes and lowered his tone. "I will tell my assistant to forward you Sora's drawing tonight," he said. "If you decide not to come, I will not trouble you again." I will not ask anything further. I only wanted to ask because Sora asked me to. The choice condensed into a small plane. Hospitality or danger. Visibility or custody of one's own narrative. Ifeoma closed her fingers around the cup of tea until the porcelain warmed her palm as though to anchor herself. Give me a moment, she said. Saying it out loud steadied her. It was not a refusal. It was a method of buying a breath. When she left the office, she felt the slight recalibration of the floor beneath her feet. People noticed her departure in small ways. Someone paused to hope the elevator would not jam. A young analyst smiled with the guarded expression of someone who has to choose alliances carefully. The city outside the office windows seemed both promising and indifferent as ever. That evening, as promised, Hiroshi's assistant emailed a photograph of Sora's drawing. The lines were naive but certain, the sun oversized, the house crooked in the way only children's drawings can be charming. A small caption in the email read, "Sora asked me to send this. She says thank you, Hiroshi." Ifeoma set the image on her kitchen counter and stood for a long time looking at the child's rendering of a world that flattened and simplified complexity into an immediate necessity. Home, sun, people. She pressed her thumb to the representation of the family and felt a sudden, unaccountable spike of tenderness for this girl who had bridged worlds with the simplest of gestures. Reiko called the next morning and spoke with the instability of someone who expertly controlled tone. I hope you are considering the advantages of staying visible, she said. She did not use the word dinner in her question. She left the suggestion open like a trapdoor. Ifeoma answered with neutral civility. She learned to move through Reiko's questions like a swimmer through water, slow, efficient, avoiding hooks. That night, before the decision was due in the quiet ledger of her own life, Ifeoma sat on the steps of a small shrine near her apartment. The air carried the crisp edge of an outside season, changing. She took a breath, inhaled the scent of incense and the city's diesel, and let her thoughts travel back across the ocean. She thought of her brother's stubborn laugh, of her mother's hand moving like a hymn over a pot, of the classroom where she was taught how to count and then ask for more than just survival. No one in her family had ever been sentimental about the language of sacrifice, but they had always spoken of it as a mutual agreement. She would send money. They would keep a life. She would be trusted to better the circle. In the small private ledger of intentions, she decided to say yes. It was not a confession. Saying yes was an act of curiosity. It was not an acceptance of a rewritten future. It was a step into a night that might teach her new things or show her new dangers. It was also practically a way to observe a child's world from a human vantage. She refused to make the invitation into currency. She would go to dinner as a person, not as a card to be traded. It felt like a risky principle, but principles were the kind of substance that allowed one to sleep. On the evening of the dinner, the rain had cut the city into a crystal net. Ifeoma took a taxi and kept her bag close. She wore a dress that was modest and comfortable, a quiet choice that would not read as provocation. She arrived at a door that opened to a house warmed by lamplight and the smell of something savory cooking. There were no reporters, no cameras at the gate. The assistant who greeted her did not carry the stiff air of ceremony. He moved with the politeness of someone who had learned that hospitality and discretion could be served together. Sora came running. Of course, as she had expected, she launched into Ifeoma's arms with the unreserved joy of a child who had already chosen trust. Ifeoma bent and lifted the girl the way she had at the gala, feeling for the second time the friction of public attention dissolving into private warmth. Sora's fingers clung to her shoulder. She whispered something about a lion in the bedtime book she wanted read later. Hiroshi was in the kitchen, standing at a counter with a pot and an apron image that, in any other context, would have been considered ordinary. He moved with a patient competence, stirring miso into a bowl with a kind of domestic confidence that did not need the pageantry of a public stage. His hands were tidy and sure. He offered a low, genuine smile that folded easily into the evening's shape. The dinner was modest. A simple broth, rice, sliced vegetables, a home-cooked meal that carried the reassuring textures of people who live in a space not for show but for comfort. The table was low and small, arranged for three. Conversation came halting at first, the cautious pleasantries giving space to more candid curiosity. Sora asked Ifeoma about Nigeria with the blunt enthusiasms of a child who loved to collect new names. "Do you have big lions?" she demanded with the single-minded logic children operate on. Ifeoma told a story about a market in Lagos, where music tangled with the voices of sellers, and an old woman who made spicy pepper soup so hot it tasted like laughter. Sora listened with a seriousness that made Ifeoma laugh out loud, the sound of an adult who had not expected such marrow-deep attention. Hiroshi watched them from across the room with the restrained pleasure of a man who had taken a step into a domestic tableau and discovered it had been decorated by someone else's ease. After dinner, they sat on the sofa while the rain softened into a hush. Hiroshi brought out a book. Its pages were slightly yellowed, and it smelled faintly of paper and domestic living. Ifeoma read to Sora a tale that was not from her childhood, but captured the same spirit. A small girl who crossed a river to find a story, and in the course of it, discovered that home can be several places at once. Sora curled closer. Her hand slipped into Ifeoma's, the gesture smaller and more exact than any photograph could convey. For a moment, the world outside the windows seemed distant and irrelevant. The household's ordinary noises cup against saucer. The quiet turning of a page felt like a chorus that vouched for the evening's gentleness. Ifeoma felt the edges of her caution round into a different kind of vigilance. The protective kind one gives to something unfolding slowly and precisely, like a new plant in a narrow pot. Hiroshi left the room to make tea, and Ifeoma watched him move with the private, unobtrusive consideration of someone who had learned to be domestic without drama. When he returned, he had 2 cups and a small plate of biscuits. He sat down opposite them and folded his hands, watching them as a man who had been allowed a small grace. "I want to thank you," he said quietly, the sentence dropping into the room like an offering. "For tonight, for the story, for being patient with Sora," Ifeoma said. "Simply, she asked me." Hiroshi smiled then with something slightly astonished. "Yes," he said, and the word carried the world. She did. When he walked her to the door afterward, the air outside had settled into the measured calm that follows rain. The streetlights glowed like soft beacons. Sora slept in her father's arms, hair tickling his cheek. He handed his daughter into the arms of a nanny who waited with an efficiency that made the small transit of custody feel like choreography studied and humane. Ifeoma stood on the threshold, a figure balanced between the company and the city. He did not ask for anything, and yet the possibility of some future gesture hung there in the charged air between them. He extended his hand, not as an imperative, but as a fragile Cadesia bridge offered to a stranger who had become less strange. When Ifeoma placed her fingers lightly in his, the touch was a small and precise thing, a handhold that said, "We have both chosen to keep our hands visible and our promises measured." "Thank you for tonight," she said. "Thank you for letting her choose you," he replied. She stepped into the taxi and watched his house recede into the glow of the street as the vehicle pulled away. The city slid by in a ribbon of lights. Her phone had a small battery left, and she opened it to the home screen. Then she locked it and kept her palms on her knees to savor the physical memory of Sora's palm against her shoulder. She had come to the dinner with a ledger in mind and left with a different, less neat accounting. The knowledge that small gestures could rearrange priorities without erasing obligations. In the office on Monday, the photograph that had ignited the week was now framed differently in the public ledger. Some of her colleagues nodded at her in a new way. Reiko watched with the same inclination she always had, neutral as a cat, calculating the arc of any story. The HR memo had remained in the background like a watchful friend. No overt condemnation came, but the world had quietly adjusted its angle of attention. Ifeoma kept her head down. She was careful at first to separate the warmth she had felt from the risks she knew existed in a corporate world. She found herself writing a message to her mother that evening, describing in small strokes the pattern of Sora's laughter and the taste of the broth she had eaten. Her mother sent back a line that said, "Be careful, but be kind." Ifeoma folded the phone in her palm and felt that both injunctions could, in fact, fit into the same life. There were private ripples, nonetheless. Gossip is not always malicious. It is often a way of naming discomfort. Phones buzzed with curiosity from distant relatives, messages from less than close acquaintances asking whether she was okay, and polite inquiries from the reception about any preferences she might have as the office navigated new impressions. Ifeoma answered the questions with the composure of someone who had been practicing a careful diplomacy. Reiko did not stop there. She made her move in the language of offers. A luncheon was scheduled a week later, and Ifeoma received a formal CC to an email that read like an opportunity, a chance to sit on a panel, a place to present some of her work to senior stakeholders. The email courted her with the promise of visibility and the soft music of growth. "If you are interested, we could frame your story," Reiko said when they met for coffee. She pushed a plate of matcha cake between them like an amicable bribe. "We could portray this as a beneficial narrative for the company, someone who is part of our culture and bringing diversity of thought. It's tidy." Ifeoma listened and then asked a question that had not yet occurred to Reiko. "What do you want me to do?" Reiko blinked as if struck by wind. "I want what is best for the company," she said coolly. "And for you, if you are a Ifeoma had learned that she could not accept kindness in packages that carried strings she could not afford. She was sure she would decide in time whether the panel would be a way to further her work with integrity or a showpiece for other people's narratives. For now, she chose to rest in the small, immediate truth she had discovered in a child's trust. Care, when given freely, created a straightforwardness that was difficult to spin into policy. 3 days later, another photograph surfaced, an image from the gala, but cropped and stylized, with a headline that ran narrow and long, "A shared moment." The comments were a cross-section of the city. Some attempted to make poetry out of what they had seen, others made cautious remarks about boundaries, and a few even expressed recognition for the quietness of an act. None of those comments would determine the course of Ifeoma's life, yet they were the kind of small pushes that nudged the world around her into a new geography. Ifeoma spent the weekend thinking about small responsibilities and large choices. She called her brother and asked about the afternoon class he was teaching. They laughed about a student who insisted that vowels are a conspiracy. She sent money the way she always did, and when she had a few minutes to herself she folded Sora's drawing into the corner of her favorite book, as if keeping a secret. On Monday morning she received an email from he. It was short, unlike the company's usual communications. It said simply, "Thank you for dinner." There was a photograph attached, one that neither the social networks nor the office was likely to have Sora asleep against a plush toy, a small smear of jam on her chin, and a scribbled thank you beside the image. The tone of the message was private, the kind of exchange that had been designed not for broadcast but for the maintenance of a delicate, emergent thing. Ifeoma kept the message on her phone like a small anchor to return to when the day felt heavy. Her work continued. The markets did not pause for tenderness, and the office retained its capacity for intrigue. But the knowledge of Sora's trust settled into a place inside her that made other things feel softer. The corporate memos, the questions about visibility, the cautious offers of opportunity. They could still be dangerous, but they now lived beside an image of a child, asleep and trust given without condition. When she walked in through the office doors that afternoon, someone said hello with a warmth that was perhaps only a reflection of the week's shared narratives. Her desk hummed with the usual activities. Spreadsheets, investor notes, a calendar that seemed to expand with each new engagement. Reiko was at her usual window station, the city stretching behind her like a map of control. Their eyes met briefly over the tops of monitors, and Reiko's expression was that practiced blank. She did not push. The week carried on with the steady momentum of a machine balancing new inputs. Ifeoma filed a report about market entry strategies for a region that few in the room understood, did a call with a partner, and read an article about startups that made extravagant promises. She kept Sora's drawing in her bag like a talisman, a private map of a child's uncomplicated geography. Then, on a rainy Thursday, a message arrived that adjusted the day's equilibrium. Hiroshi wanted to speak again, this time, not in the office but simply to ask a favor. Would Ifeoma consider being someone who could occasionally spend time with Sora? There would be no expectations beyond play and stories. He made the request with a gentle, almost apologetic clause. Would she consider being someone who could occasionally spend time with Sora? There would be no expectations beyond play and stories. He made the request with a modesty that suggested he understood how many stories like this could be read sideways. Ifeoma read his face, as well as she read numbers. He was asking for companionship for his daughter, yes, but he was also asking to share a small domestic trust. The invitation carried with it an implied workload of attention: late afternoons, explanations, the unglamorous business of entering and exiting another family's rhythm. She thought of the ledger on her phone that always balanced money against time, and she thought of Sora's crayon sun, which still sat folded in the corner of her book like an unspent promise. No salary, no strings, Hiroshi said quietly, anticipating an objection as much as offering a condition. Just play and stories. If you are comfortable, we can schedule it only when you are available. I will ensure there is discretion at the office, and I will speak directly to Reiko. The word discretion made Ifeoma feel something like relief, but also the precise prick of skepticism. Promises could be eloquent, and people could forget things that were inconvenient. Still, the way he spoke plain, private, not performative. It was not a contract, but a request to be trusted in a small domestic way. She agreed to try, with a single condition of her own. She would remain as she was at work, distinct and uncompromised in professional matters. I will come when I can, she said. But this is not a path. It is an evening with a child. The words felt careful and right. Hiroshi nodded and, with his usual restraint, made it official in the small ways that matter an email to HR noting that the chairman had asked for privacy in this personal matter. A conversation with his assistant to guard the schedule. A brief, firm word to Reiko that this was not to be used as a narrative for corporate gain. Reiko, to her credit, received the instruction with the same polished, neutral face she reserved for inconvenient variables. Later, in private, she would Those are the small moral economies of institutions. The visits began, as Hiroshi had promised, sporadic and domestic. They became a small rhythm in Ifeoma's life that she did not expect to hold weight. Some afternoons, Sora wanted to make cranes folding tiny wings from origami paper, while Ifeoma showed her how to crease the center just so. Sora's fingers were quick and the result was delightful chaos. On others, the girl wanted to hear stories about markets and rain and the way the moon looked different over Lagos. Ifeoma found herself teaching a simple lullaby, the syllables bending on her tongue in English and in scraps of Igbo that slipped out like careful, private offerings. Sora hummed along with the tuneless loyalty of a child who loves the sound more than its accuracy. Hiroshi often hovered near the edges of these afternoons. He made tea, refilled bowls, or retreated to his study, to leave them their space. In private, he observed with the watchfulness of a man who had learned to love through small, domestic acts, rather than grand displays. He would sometimes, when Sora was particularly animated, ask Ifeoma questions about her home, how markets smelled at dawn, what foods made her mother laugh, and he would listen in a way that made Ifeoma feel less like an exhibit and more like a person whose world had weight. For Ifeoma, these visits were not simply a kindness. They were a mirror. Her work, the remittances she wired, the careful professional guard she maintained, all of it was part of a life that had, until then, been largely transactional. These afternoons cracked something open, the easy pleasure of being seen as both competent and human. Sora's affection had no scale. It was not tied to titles or performance. It simply existed, a curious gravity that rearranged small things inside her. News, as it will, found edges. Someone in the office noticed a pattern, an analyst who saw her leave at irregular times, a cleaner who saw the soft exchange of tea packets, and speculation, tentative and mostly idle, resumed its work. Reiko saw patterns more clearly. She returned, as she always did, with another offer in the language of advancement. I could arrange a feature, she said one morning, sliding a corporate brief across Ifeoma's desk. A human interest piece. It would frame your involvement as community engagement and align you with our CSR initiatives. Think of the visibility. Ifeoma listened. The brief was generous on paper but tight in consequence. Framed one way, it meant recognition. Funds perhaps diverted to initiatives that mattered. Framed another way, it meant the smearing of a private kindness across a public stage. I prefer to keep my story private, she said, and meant it. This is for Sora, not for the company. Reiko's face did that small, neutral tilt that acknowledged the presence of a boundary. I respect that, she said, and then, precise as a scalpel, added, but note that visibility also protects. If you decline, there is little to shield you from gossip. It was not a threat so much as a factual statement about how reputations are managed. In a company, visibility can sometimes be armor. Sometimes, it is a blade. Ifeoma weighed the options like a ledger. Protecting herself meant keeping the story limited. Accepting Reiko's brief meant opening her life to a different kind of vulnerability, one that might be cushioned, but that would still be public. She chose discretion. She allowed the afternoons with Sora to remain small and private, and she maintained her professional rigor. The boundaries were not impermeable. There were moments when colleagues asked casual questions in the elevator, or when a board member sent a polite inquiry about whether she might present at a luncheon, but, for the most part, the arrangement held by mutual, mostly unspoken agreement. Their intimacy, such as it was, remained a gradual thing. There was a gentle choreography to their interactions. If she arrived late, Sora would greet her with a solemn recounting of a toy's misadventure. If Hiroshi was in the room, he would offer a quiet comment about a new book he had read. Once, while Ifeoma read the girl a story about a river, Hiroshi paused at the threshold and, without preamble, told her about a fishing trip he had taken when he was a child, how the boat smelled of tar and rope, how the sun drew a line on the water as if it were writing. The revelation was ordinary and intimate, a man remembering a day without ceremony. Ifeoma watched the way the memory softened him, and felt, in small increments, how guardedness can become lonely scaffolding. Yet the world outside that soft space did not forget its own appetite. A columnist, searching for material about CEOs and their human sides, painted the gala photograph into a thumbnail story about unexpected kindnesses. The article quoted an anonymous guest and threaded the narrative with broad assumptions. The piece did not name Ifeoma, but it fed a neighborhood of gossip. A shared photograph, cropped and captioned, made its way onto a popular feed. Comments arrived, in the office, some warm, some blunt, some suspicious. It was the texture of being visible in a city that liked to talk. Then, a more pointed friction arrived. An investor's spouse, invited to a charity event, remarked playfully in an email about the chairman's interesting new acquaintance. And the note circulated a polite joke, but jokes sometimes solidify into reputations. An HR representative, mindful of optics, asked Ifeoma to meet briefly, folding the language of procedure into the conversation. We just want to ensure that there are clear boundaries, the representative said. Nothing is being alleged. We simply need to confirm that you are comfortable and that you are not being pressured. Ifeoma answered calmly, explaining the voluntary nature of her visits and the protective assurances Hiroshi had made. She felt, though, how the very act of explanation places a person in the frame of defense. The request for a meeting, while held a quiet pressure akin to being asked to prove the terms of one's generosity. Hiroshi, for his part, moved with a deliberate carefulness. He spoke to the HR director privately, reiterating his promise to keep the matter off the public agenda and to instruct his team to avoid leveraging the incident. He wrote an internal note to Reiko, polite and unmistakable in tone, requesting that she respect Ifeoma's privacy. Reiko complied outwardly, but the office's currents had already shifted subtly. People are, after all, creatures of patterns. Over time, the small domestic rituals piled up into something that felt less like novelty and more like a life threaded through two worlds. Ifeoma spent an afternoon teaching Sora to braid paper into a crown, and was surprised at how proud the girl looked when she placed it on her head. Sora declared Ifeoma the queen who knows stories, and the title made Ifeoma laugh until her throat felt warm. In exchange, Hiroshi shared a bowl of miso soup that tasted of quiet evenings and the small competence of making something nourishing for another person. One evening, as autumn began to lean cold, an unexpected misreading at work threatened the careful balance they had maintained. A junior analyst, trying to be helpful, drafted an internal newsletter celebrating human moments in leadership, and included a line about the chairman's daughter and the woman who held her at the gala. The draft circulated briefly before someone noticed and pulled it, but the moment of exposure mattered. It sparked an HR inquiry and, in the office rumor mill, a spike of speculation. Ifeoma felt an old anxiety clamber back, the one that had taught her to speak in measured sentences and to fold personal life into a private envelope. She braced herself for consequences. But what surprised her was not the scrutiny so much as the way Hiroshi moved to protect the smallness they had established. He came to her office mid-afternoon with a silent apology in his eyes and a simple bowl of green tea, handed over by his assistant with the quiet efficiency of ritual. "I asked them to withdraw it," he said, closing the door gently. "I don't want anyone